Good evening and welcome to Living Art. It's KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, KPFT HD1. Yeah, great to have you with us tonight. So good to have an audience that tunes in and catches what's going on live from Caroline Street with our and everybody's friendly, listener-sponsored, commercial-free radio station here in Houston for a long time, since the 70s, actually. So, yeah, thanks for tuning in. I'm Michael Woodson, host of Living Art with Michael Carson. Good evening, Michael Carson.
Good evening, Michael.
We want to thank Messiah Atomic Guy, who is getting a little board training tonight. So that's exciting. Thanks for doing it.
You're welcome. Yeah, blame it all on him. If anything goes wrong, it's Messiah's fault.
And speaking of great listeners, we've already got some people to thank for donations, and it's never too soon to donate. We have Fund Drive in 2 weeks, and we've got some very, very generous donations already, and that's kind of pleasing. How does that make you feel, Michael? Greg and Rose, thanks so much for your generous donations.
Yeah, it means a lot. I mean, it's huge to have that support from our community and to help us keep on going and bring in artists on, local community artists, and kind of bring in this continuing this conversation about art in different ways. And thank you. And
that's just not a polite thank you, or like that's a heartfelt, this is worth doing. Thank you.
Yes, you made this possible.
I wish I could reach out there and put how grateful I am into your hearts, because you would feel good. And yes, a donation to KPFT, whether we're grateful or not, will make you feel good, because you're part of something that's old and new, been around a long time, going to be around for a long time, and we're trying to do something meaningful, purposeful, something with an aim. We have a task here at Pacifica, not to be too large about it, but yeah, it's Radio for Peace, and we talk about matters of the world that need to be spoken of. I guess the word I was going to say is we're critical. We have a critical eye on things, and that's just not to say what's wrong, but to say what is, I guess, and say that's not enough.
Yeah, I like that. We make bringing the old to the new and the new to the old. Like, the modernists, make it new was their big thing, where we bring it back to the old and the old to the new, and kind of change people's minds about both and make people see connections and, hopefully change the world. Of course, that's the goal, right? We're saving everybody.
We could be grandiose narcissists, but that doesn't make us wrong.
Right, and that's how change happens somewhere.
Anyway, nothing's perfect, but we do appreciate your donations, Greg and Rose, and all of you who donate and will donate. So important. We talked about that in a meeting yesterday, programmers meeting. We have a fun drive coming up. But tonight, getting on to the content, we're going to talk about George Orwell, because after last week's show, where Michael and I often do a kind of a separate private
can't stop talking
podcast.
So we just keep on going.
we ended up with George Orwell, and look, we're both working stiffs.
Right, yeah.
I consider
you could call it that. Yeah, definitely.
We've got a workload that anybody might say that's a lot. Like 100 students with 5 essays per student, that kind of load.
Yeah, it's a rough time of the semester. But before we get going on that, just social media stuff, new account, right? New email. Should
That's
we
right.
Push that out?
Great.
So if they want to reach out, if they have ideas for the show or want to come on the show, we should, or you want to just talk to us.
Yeah, so that is livingart.kpft@gmail, or you can use the old one, 3trillion@yahoo.com. That was Ronald Reagan's deficit when he left. He came in it with 1, and he left with 3 trillion, and now we're at 33 trillion, and that was in 88 that he left. So anyway, 3 trillion. I'm trying to get you to remember how easy this is.
Right.
Just spell out 3 trillion at Yahoo.
I'll remember that for sure now. Yeah, we got brand new social media out there. Yeah, come support, like us. and email us if you want to be part of it. And yeah, if you can donate anything helps as we move into fund drive and keep the station going.
And you do that at kpft.org. So 1984, the reason why I bring up working stiffs is, first of all, it is the condition of what we're doing here. It's volunteerism, and we don't have a chance to look over literature 40 hours a week and then do a radio show like a lot of people do, like if you do this for a living. So I just want to say that, and maybe we can identify with the prolies.
Yes, in our way. In our way. But
not that my life sucks that bad, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. The proles are the big question of this book. The proles, can they save us or not? Yeah, I hesitate to identify with them. We're probably the middle group with the Winston. We're in Winston's world.
Truly, yeah. We're the professional managerial class, no question.
We're not a prole.
Yeah, that's functional. But there is something hard-nosed about the gig, and that's what 1984 is about, because Winston, who, is just a paper shuffler and worse, has all kinds of hope for the proles, we're going to say tonight. I don't know why I say proles, but
yeah, it might be that. I don't know. I've never heard it Orwell say it. It might be proles, but that we should talk a little bit about, I guess, what we got to this, right? Because at the end of the last episode, we talked a lot about the Barbie movie and Oppenheimer, and we were thinking about Trotsky, of course, and political art, and kind of these arguments at the end of the 1940s, late 1930s, early 1940s, whether or not art could still be meaningful given the state of the world during World War II. It was a big controversy for a lot of thinkers and big name writers at the time. And maybe it's not as big as a controversy now, but you still have conversations about whether art is meaningful in the ways that it used to be, or whether it can change the world, or what should art do, which is something we think about often on this show. And so we talked about that in the late 1930s, and whether or not the movies out there right now are kind of meaningful in the way that art used to be since World War II or before World War II, if it ever was that way. And we started thinking about 1984, which is a famous book that comes out right after World War II, right? And it kind of falls right into this tradition as part of this kind of march of whatever literature was. And it's at a critical moment, because it would be like when art can no longer do what it could used to do, right? But we have this book that we're still reading, right? High school classrooms still teach this across the country, I think, at this point. Kids still read it. It's a book that's still living in some ways.
The terms are still used, double
it's
speed.
all over our language. And so you have this really kind of odd situation where even the writer of the book is, and we talked a little bit about before the show, is saying that art is dead, like real meaningful art, yet he continues to write just to do something, right? Yet his book has become incredibly meaningful for a lot of people in all political stripes, and would see it as an example of a political novel that works. And so we should maybe study that. Is that true? Or is it effective? And talk a little bit about, I guess, what it is, and if people don't know the story of 1984.
Right. And, what brought us to the discussion of 1984 was, the essays by Trotsky and Greenberg. Most people, when they hear Trotsky, I'm sure they don't think of art, but, he wrote a very influential essay in history, and history is a whole nother topic to talk about tonight. But, that Trotsky is in his influence, and Greenberg with his influence, and their premise that art is sort of foundering, and art has lost its way, maybe not even to its own fault, but just because the purpose of radical change has lost its way in the world.
Yeah, and I think that's their premise for both of them, that radical change has ceased to become possible because of what has happened to the left and the right, essentially, in the world they live in. And thus the art that we create can't somehow channel that change in any real way because of the political situation. And their arguments are incredibly meaningful. Maybe they seem kind of distant to us now, but I still think this idea of whether there was a time in art history for about 200 years where people thought art was tied up with the zeitgeist and moving the world, right, and intertwined with what we did. And you have two prominent art critics here, and also Trotsky being a political leader, right, saying art can't do what it maybe once did, right?
Well, I think the proposition, starting with painting, all right, if you use painting as your focus, and you look at it historically, you can hardly deny that at a certain point, art was in service of religion, because all the subjects were religious. If you go to the museum and you look at paintings that are 1500 and 1400 and 1300 and 1200,
right.
The pre-Renaissance art is religious. Now, we may appreciate, some of the devilishness that they put in it and that kind of thing, but basically, it was doing what it was told, and then it didn't. And if you think of Picasso or somebody, like, they're not in the service of religion. These artists, the modern artists, are in the service of humanity, you might call it.
Right. And so it's all kind of this weird outgrowth of the French Revolutionary tradition that art can do something different than just be the entertainment on one level, or some kind of patron like a church or a king says, make something pretty for me.
Yeah, the propaganda, and it's interesting you say that, because the thing that art shouldn't do, according, I think it's Trotsky, would be, it shouldn't just be propaganda, in other words, preachy,
right?
And it shouldn't be just entertaining.
Right, and that's where Trotsky differs from Stalin, right, in this fight that they're in at the time over, Stalin says it should be propaganda, it should do that, and that's what it does effectively, like the church used to say, that's where the word comes from the Catholic Church, and it's supposed to propagate ideas, right?
It was not always a bad word. Like, I learned it from Orwell, so I've always taken it as a pejorative, but propaganda and its roots are basically teaching.
Right, exactly, and so a lot of, if you're outside of this kind of Western liberal humanist tradition, propaganda is not necessarily a bad thing. And it's funny how Orwell has kind of made that word popular and how we see it. And we should say, before we even get into 1984, he wrote a lot of essays, including politics in the English language, kind of criticizing the modern world's tendency to how we talk and how we use words. And a lot of the things that he said became how we still talk about these things today. And like a word like propaganda. I mean, people were aware that Orwell was not the only one saying that, but he could say it most effectively because of just his own power with language.
Some of the background on 1984 then. It was written in 1948, and he was on his deathbed, basically died of tuberculosis, and needed a title, so he just flipped the years, the numbers from 48 to 84, and that's a good thing to know, because it was seen when I was a kid before 1984 as a science fiction book of prophecy.
Right.
And then in 2023, no one would think of 1984 as the future.
Right. Well, there's another story that I think there's multiple stories, because there's an author I enjoyed a lot when I was growing up, Chesterton, and who Orwell knew well. He knew Chesterton, respected him, not his politics, but his writing. And there's a dystopian book Chesterton wrote like in 1908, and where the world all goes, like the whole book takes place in 1984. And so to me, I know Orwell would have read that book, and so I don't know, he might have multiple stories for how he came up with the title.
I did not hear that. I'll put that.
That's only because I know Chesterton. I know he had loved Chesterton, so I feel that I think he already had a soft spot in his mind for 1984. But anyway,
sometimes I think life is a dream, and I don't even know where I got that idea that he flipped it. But
it could be. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's probably what he said. And authors say different things. And
could
it's
be
funny,
both.
And it's not the year itself is funny, because we get hung up on the year. Like when you're growing up, like what's going to happen in 1984, But the whole point of the book too is that we're kind of already there, right? We're already in this world
of the way it is,
right? And yet people want to say, like, we want to project this into the future, and Orwell's critique of the world that we're in is like, this is we've already kind of gone here, right? And how this book has been discussed ever since is this huge argument, like whether we're truly in this 1984 world, or whether this is where we might be, some extreme version of our current world. And it's such a fascinating book. I mean, if our viewers, our listeners don't know anything about 1984, so many words come from it. What's some of the words? Like newspeak. Yeah, newspeak. Doublethink. Okay. Yeah, and when you talk about politics or look at a political blog, they'll use these words all the time.
Thought control.
Groupthink. Yeah, well, that's like 4 or 5.
And many, many, many more.
Yeah, there's a couple more in there. And I don't know, I always love Orwell because his understanding of euphemism, and a way that the modern world has like advanced a new language to cover the actuality of what we're doing, the reality of what we're doing. And so we're not actually talking half the time. We're kind of trading words back and forth that have prefigured meanings, so there's not actual conversation. And so for like a show like this, we're obsessed over like living art and having good conversations. Orwell points out like how our language has been abused to such a degree that you can't have honest conversations. And he sees it getting worse and worse, what's coming next. And
yeah, that's the whole thing about double plus good or something. Like,
right.
You don't want a word that's exquisite is not a word you need in 1984 or in this totalitarian society.
Right.
You just need to say good plus 2 or something like that.
It's easier. It's simpler. Yeah. I mean, and when you think of things like, the big obvious connection is things like texting and emojis. Like, it's all in 1984. He says it's easier for people, so people will go to that. And you lose, like, say there's 10 words for 10 different variations of happy. Now we have a smiley face, right? And everyone uses the smiley face, and it's simpler, it's more effective, it's more efficient, right? And that's a world where things are more efficient. And he was right. we all use smiley faces now. I mean, I use them. I'm an English teacher. I use smiley faces.
Thumbs up.
Yeah. And then that's become, and like, I guess the iPhone has like, haha, smiley face. There's 5 like things, and I use them all the time. At first I was really uncomfortable, but it's easy, right? But I mean, if you look at, I don't know, you use any, like Shakespeare or something like that, like ha ha, of course, there's like 100 different registers of words you could use for laughter, right? But now we're all just saying ha ha.
I don't want to stay on this point too long. If you do, fine. But the thing is, for a while, they wouldn't even let you do a frowny face if they do now, right? Like Facebook limits the negativity.
Right.
Because, I mean, it's a good business decision. You don't want people... I just have cuss words in my vocabulary for this, but you don't want people to get all...
Right, and how language and images shape our experiences. And
nasty.
So like, if you can't frown, then you're frowning less, I guess. It's like a form of thought control, you could say. And like, and how these things shape our whole... Yeah, it's a big problem, and it's not going away anytime soon. I mean, the whole controversy with ChatGPT was the way that they're shaping it and limiting what the computer says and the language it can go towards. And of course, it's always happening. We're always kind of fighting this battle. But he saw this happening with technology and the way that radio and TV worked. He saw that language was like being winnowed and limited to become more efficient and less capable of communicating anything real. Right. And that was he was terrified of that world. He saw that happening. He said that World War II happened because of this movement. And his argument, of course, is like, it's only going to get worse, and we're in this kind of worse world. I always wonder about that. I mean, is it all that? Is he kind of being hysterical? Like, this is the end of the world. Now we're using emojis, or not? Like, and is there always a form of propaganda and a form of newspeak?
And can you hold people's discontents down? And that's tying into what we said last week, which is that art expresses suffering. That was Adorno, right? Like something that matters. Like you're crying out for your happiness, the pursuit of happiness, and given, not to be too depressed, but because most of the time we have to adjust to normalcy, but you don't have to think very hard to realize just how miserable people can be and how limited your
life
own...
is hard, yeah, no matter what.
Life is hard is the point, yeah. And so, you don't want to be too negative that way, but if all you have is what language is being fed to you,
right?
Can you hold people down to the smiley face? Like at one point, it reminds me a lot of this, movie V. That is it? I don't think I have it the right. But anyway, where the people finally just
V for Vendetta.
Yeah.
Okay, I do remember.
The people just who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? They will, that smiley face is not going to cut it because, it's just too limiting to human experience.
Right, that's a great point. Yeah, it's a fun movie too, and definitely inspired by 1984, and the original comic book, I think. But something I wanted to mention that was like funny with Facebook. We should not go off into a tangent here, but even if it limits stuff, like Facebook is a place where people are very unhappy often, right? And they express their unhappiness all over the place, right? And so that is in no way working. the no frowny face rule is not working at all on Facebook. And so it speaks to this idea that there's nothing, you can do these things, but people will express their dissatisfaction or what they want to do. They'll invent new ways of doing it. And I think that's something interesting when I think about Orwell's like the dangers of newspeak and how it limits our ability. Humans, I think, are clever enough they'll flip it around and play games with it. And so even though we only have like 5 emojis or whatever on the phone, like they'll play with it and make messages that kind of undermine it. And I think like memes and how they can say a million different things within like one picture, you know? And so I have faith in humans' potential to like undermine newspeak, I guess maybe more so than Orwell did.
You're listening to Living Art on KPFT Houston. I'm Michael Woodson with Michael Carson. And now Orwell, George Orwell, was a kind of Tory, and I don't know if you want to call him a liberal Tory or something like that, but he's not a Marxist. He's not a communist, right? He's I don't think you would say that he's a Republican or a Democrat in his political aspirations. I think he was a Tory, and his book is you know, when you read it, you can read it from the view of something went terribly wrong, and there's some in the world, and there's you know, there's something that we let loose of, we let go, that we shouldn't have.
A little bit of biography on him, though. I think it's interesting. I mean, he was born into like a upper middle class family in India as like, I guess, part of the empire, right? And then he was sent to school at Eton, which is like a rich kid's school. So he's like upper middle class. But he famously drops out of all that in his 20s, and he's like a hardcore socialist, like as they get. And he lives among the poor and writes for about 10 years. He's living with the poorest of the poor in France and places of England, and writes about it.
Catalonia or something.
That's a little bit later. Okay. Like, and before he does all that, he actually like lives like a working class people. He's passionately socialist. And then he, in the 30s,
just because you work with the poor doesn't make you a socialist, though. Necessarily, but
yeah, I shouldn't make cause and effect, but that he isn't politically aligned with everything going on the left in the Marxist way that you get aligned throughout the 20s and early 30s. He then participates in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side as one that is supporting the Republican against the fascists.
Anti-fascist.
Yeah, and he's wounded fighting there. After the war, his politics shift, and also after he's seeing what's happening with Stalinism, and he becomes increasingly not anti-socialist in any way, but he's critical of the left project because of Stalinism. He's still, to the end, he still said he was still a socialist.
Okay.
But he said he was vehemently, against the Stalin's world and utopianism and what had happened to the left. And he pretty much, the rest of the left kind of cut him off because of this book and Animal Farm, and also his own kind of opinions. But he saw, after what he saw in Spain and whatever he saw what Stalin was doing in the Soviet Union, he said that the current political realities what the left is doing, he could not participate in it, and it was part of the problem. And you get this kind of same, almost that the Trotsky feeling, where things are just too much of a mess and all options in the moment won't work, and until there's some new world, nothing can happen. And you hear that kind of from Orwell, and you get that from Trotsky too. And I guess I think that's important to see. He comes from a very socialist background, and this is the enormous power of 1984 is because it's a critique from within in some ways of what could possibly happen.
Yeah,
what had happened.
I'm just encouraging an open-minded reading of it. I've heard that he's got it can be put in the camp of some sort of liberal Tory or something like that. But the names don't matter, and the period that he was socialist is not my point. I'm edified. I appreciate.
Well,
that
when you
history.
Say Tory, like Tory is like the arch conservative party of the British. What do you mean by that?
Well, it would be maybe a desire to go back to the good old days or something. Whether or not he did or didn't,
right.
Like if you read this book, that's a nice way to check you up as you're thinking about, is he just anti any particular thing, or is he promoting any particular thing? So he's pretty down on totalitarianism. What are his thoughts about the Soviet Union? What are his thoughts about Europe, and what are his thoughts about the New Deal, stuff like that, right? As you would apply it to real changes. Reading the book, I think it helps to ask, like, what is his political leaning, and he's pretty down on Stalinism, right, and on any sort of socialism that is top down.
Yes.
which
Yeah.
is, any kind of socialism from the age, I think, if you look at, like Cuba or something like that, right? In our age, Venezuela, it really is like a takeover of government, right? Top-down kind of political movement. So anyway, I read that with the thought in mind, knowing that he's really critical of communism, and then like, well, what does he prefer? Well, he prefers humanity. He prefers free speech. He prefers a world of non-contradiction. I'm not sure that that necessarily makes him a socialist. I'm not sure the book has socialist tones to it.
Oh no, I was just saying in terms of his background, what his biography, I guess, by the time he wrote this book, he had broken away from all those different parties and his own kind of thing, and he, I think that's important going into this book. It's an expression of despair over the whole political moment, the entire range of it, and the options available within the world. Right. And you get the force of it. And I think that's important too, because this book speaks to all kinds of readers, and why that is always kind of fascinating to me. But yeah, we should talk a little bit about the book. So the book itself, he wrote it on his deathbed, right? And it's a dystopian world that is a future world that is could be seen as the world that he's living in some ways, right? And this character Winston, our hero, right? He's just like you said earlier, like a middle management paper pusher, right? In this kind of big bureaucratic building in a very rundown, gross London. Like everything's this kind of crumbly and not as nice as it used to be. And you get that feeling in the beginning of the book. The food's gross. Everything's just like
everything's grimy
and just in a very nothing shiny and new, right? But he muddles along, and what department does he work for? Do you remember within the departments? I know they have like the Department of Peace, which is like the War Department, and so everything's opposite, of course.
But he's in charge of changing of the history, so it's information.
Right. Memory hole is another one that this book comes up with. But yeah, he's in charge of, what was that? The Ministry of, they do the opposites. Like the Ministry of War is the Ministry of Peace, and like they have the other one is like the history is the past. They flip everything around.
Ministry of Truth or something.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
He's trashing data.
Right, and so the truth is that you hide the truth, right? That is truth, and that's how you create it. And you open this book up, and his initial things, what he does every day is he puts things in memory holes, right? And there's a huge irony here. Like you think a memory hole like has memories, but it's where you get rid of memories, right? And it's erasing the immediate past in ways that have like, I mean, if you're reading it in a historical way, it's very much like the inter-party politics of the Soviet Union. You could read into that, but like well,
it's like taking George W. Bush and making him a kind, loving painter of puppy dogs and cats.
Right. And the way that
all that stuff about the war of aggression gets thrown down the memory hole.
Right. I guess I was speaking because we're just talking about Trotsky. Like there's a character in there that's like completely straight Trotsky. Like you can like read him as the character that is being memory holed. But you're right. It comes up everywhere. He was not just saying that this is a problem in one place, and that's another joke in the book. It's Oceania versus, what is it? Eurasia, and you can't really tell who's who or which side is which, and their enemies change like every couple months, and the people just go with it because they're just kind of like, that's how it's always been, right? And I don't even know why we're angry at them, but they keep on switching kind of sides.
Russia's our friend, now Russia's our enemy.
Right.
China, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And so like the big blocks, and now we're like aligned with this vaguely capitalist socialist thing versus we're aligned with the meaning of the words have been completely like absolved or erased, right? Like it's just and you find out through the book, it doesn't matter who, as long as that you're in war with somebody, everyone's kind of goes along with things, right? And that's a crucial aspect of this new world.
People do not think critically.
Right. People don't have to, and they, and the wartime effort kind of keeps it going. There's a lot of striking moments in it, like they play movies constantly of like the victories somewhere else or the other side being killed in some ways, and that you have the crowds like cheering, and they're very much like participating in it. And it's always been powerful to me because he's writing this, in 1949 during World War II, when this is happening. Like you're fighting these giant battles, and people are participating through movies in what's happening. And he's kind of recording it in this like imagined dystopia. So it's a frightening place there.
That's the history, right? And in short, you're at war with East Asia, and then suddenly they announce that you've always been at war with Eurasia, the other third of
Right.
the planet, and no one blinks an eye,
Yeah.
But I do want to talk about the love story because, language and history, those are two huge things that we could talk about until 8 o'clock.
Yeah, I have
half an
1,000
hour.
things to say about the whole switching things because Orwell writes about that elsewhere, but we'll come back to it. Yeah.
And there's way too much. And if you want to read, the book, right, O'Brien's book, I mean, there's an appendix with all kinds of detailed analysis, and like you could spend a lifetime sorting that out and what it means and how brilliant it is. But the love story is he meets Julia, and he decides to have this sordid affair. With the irony of sordid affairs, all the love you're going to find, and then at the end, he the point of the book is you can still hold something personal, something private, something true to yourself. Like the whole world may be telling you 2 and 2 is 4. I mean, 2 and 2 is 5, but you can still believe that, and know, and it's your reality. And you can, the way he touches the individualism or the sense of individual reality is through love, which I think is a good way to do it. And the whole question of the book is, can they make you not just betray your love, but actually erase it? In other words, you never loved in the first place.
Right. Yeah, and whether it's a range, I think it's cool to think about like Winston when he comes in. It's been a while since I've read it, but I read it a couple times. Like where he's kind of disquieted by things he's putting in the memory hole, right? He's just like any good dystopian story in movies you watch, like you're in this society and you're like, wait a minute, one character's like, something's wrong here, like I'm not quite okay with this.
George Bush is painting puppy dogs,
right? Yeah, there's something there's something off about how like we kind of forget things, and you're the one character who's asking questions, right? You're like, wait a minute, and then no one else seems to be responding to this. But this is crucial. That's why Orwell's a genius. You have O'Brien, who works with Winston, and they see each other from across the room, and they're like, oh, you see the George W. Bush problem, right? Like they both wake up to it, right? And he's like, oh, you're my friend, you get what's going on. This isn't quite
crucial.
Right. And it's brilliant because he's like, finally I have a friend and I can think for myself with somebody. And that's, speaking of love or friendships, in terms of like, I can be private with somebody. I don't have to go with the public thing at all in any way. I'm getting exciting, hitting things in here. I'm talking about 1984.
No, that was Messiah's fault.
Right. But yeah, and so I love that moment in the book because Winston's like, he feels seen and he has a private life, and it quickens something inside of him that is not this kind of grimy totalitarian sameness, where it's obviously false, but he's trying to convince himself that this is reality, right? And so he sees O'Brien, which you've already kind of given a little bit away. O'Brien is actually the bad guy in the book. He's the one, he's playing Winston. And I think that's such a brilliant Orwell move, that the government itself is so totalitarian, it knows when someone's thinking for themselves, and they put someone like O'Brien, the one who's orchestrating everything. He's befriending him because he wants to like ferret out any kind of privacy. Anyone who thinks for themselves or thinks they can have kind of relationships outside of the given norm, right?
Or if their purpose or their meaning. This is the crucial, this is the
right.
guts of it. Like I think everybody that's listening, just anybody on the planet really believes that their individuality matters. It's like, and it does in our government, because we're in our Constitution we're guaranteed the right to assemble, the right to free speech. We have these individual rights.
Right. We make a big deal about saying that. Yeah.
Yeah. And we believe them. I mean, COVID speaks to that. I know we don't want to get into that, but like people feel, like something about the jab, getting the whole thing that happened 3 years ago, right? And it sort of boils down to something like that, where like I have my own mind, I have the right to think about it, and that's reality. And this book really is a satire that argues, and I think disturbingly convinces you that that's just not so, that your individualism can be broken. It's like you're going to die and that's it.
I don't know. It's that depressing.
It is. I'll argue that.
Yeah, no, it's depressing, but I mean, he's relentless. We can argue maybe like ultimately where he goes with it and how we want to end it.
Well, that's why it's satire,
right.
Because he's giving you that proposition. What's that worth to you? That sense that you actually were in love, and that anyway. This just encourage the readers to look at the scene where he and Julia break up, and when he meets her for the last time, there's no kidding. Like, he doesn't recognize her. He doesn't believe anything that he felt in trying to hold on that thin thread of, like, is sordid and dark and seedy and unromantic as this whole thing is. I still have this feeling for her, right? This attraction, and they cannot tell me that never happened and it wasn't real. And in the end, I think he's convinced. Like, his eyes are glazed over.
Right. Yeah. No, it moves there eventually, and it's a harsh ending. I guess I wanted just to stay a little bit on that moment with O'Brien and the first moment when he meets Julia. And like what's happening and why it's yet deeply, like, it's so disturbing of a book is that's orchestrated by the regime. And so his openness to this conversation with O'Brien and his relationship with Julia is also sanctioned by the regime.
Parallel. That's the same issue. It matters to him that he has a friend who gets it, and it matters to him that he is in love.
Right. But they're all working for the regime. And so it's the idea that...
Well, Julia is not.
Well, she's she gets pulled into it, and they have these spaces. I guess what's always struck me is like, and this gets to your point, I think, about that we live in things that we think are hopeful escapes from the moment, like love or like a friendship, are actually reproducing the problems of the regime. You're all sucked in no matter what you do, and so they're conditioned as like little outlets to keep the whole thing going, right? And so when you think you're going to the forest to break away, like there's a whole forest kind of scene. That is known. All this is known by O'Brien. Like, he knows about everything. He's letting them do it because he needs to kind of get out people he knows they're going to think for themselves. This is a way to give you enough rope to hang yourself in this kind of society. And so these moments, what's scary about the book to me personally is the moment he's asking, the moments when you think you're free, when you think you found love, you think you found friendship or something, you're actually playing into the regime's hand every single thing that you do. You're participating in it. And this is that's what totalitarianism is. Like, it's not this simple kind of school version where it's like obviously bad, like policemen coming down and like going in your house. It's
making you do something.
Yeah, you're doing it yourself, and you think that the moments you're being free, right, you're getting pulled more into it. And yeah, she turns out to be a spy. I mean, this is kind of played into it. Everything to me, how I always understood it anyways, is that, yeah, you're reading it as a reader because you're used to these books and the hero, and he's slowly gaining his freedom, because books have been written like that in England for hundreds of years because they thought about these problems. What makes his unique to me is that there is no escape from it. Like, you can't, like, you move out from it and you find out that you're still being played by the regime, because O'Brien has thought of everything and how this works. And what he's really trying to do is break down, like you said, how the mind actually thinks it has a spot for itself in the universe, and the possibility of any kind of true rebellion. And it's enormously despairing from that perspective to me whenever I kind of trying to confront what Orwell is saying, and if he feels that this is where we're at. But I also think that I just really think it's important to think about O'Brien as a role here.
Well, I think the basis of how totalitarian can work on us is even more disturbing. You're listening, and more on that in a minute. Let me just remind the listener, our amazing and great listeners, that it's KPFT Houston. I'm Michael Woodson with Michael Carson, and you're listening to Living Art live from Caroline, and we're not being mind controlled that we know.
So we think, yeah.
I'm sure we're guilty of.
We're all in the system. Yeah,
we're all in the system. But where do we leave off? The thing is, love could just be intense codependence. I mean, it can come down to something like they break you, and what you thought really mattered. When you met your significant other, and you had the youth of your life, and everything that really mattered in your memory for what counted, and then they just give you kind of a scientific explanation. Yeah, that's all nice and stuff, but now that you're 72 years old and you really appreciate that, think about it. Was that not just codependence? You don't feel spring fresh anymore. Can you really hold on to that special somebody and in that way, or can we just convince you it is codependency at the time, and you've been conditioned to desire another like that, and I tried to say it in a way that would make my point, which is they can break the reality. You know, the question is not so much totalitarianism, but really what are we as a people who, you know, think that our love is intense and eternal and stuff like that and really matters, and it's just like codependency.
Yeah, I mean, and again, like, it's funny when you play with words from a certain perspective, you can look at it that way, right? Like from a distance, and then from not being in that relationship, but being in it, it becomes something else entirely. One of the moving scenes to me is always the apartment scene when they are together, right? And then they're not allowed, the girls don't wear makeup in this society. They don't need to. And it's important to see Winston's married too. He's been giving a wife, you know, by the system. And he's having
but divorced, or separated for 10 years.
Right. And so this is an affair where he's finally like finding a spark of life again, right? And yeah, and then she like puts makeup on, and they're doing very bourgeois things that they have been essentially outlawed, you know, like you're dressing up. And
Stalin would call that decadent bourgeois.
Exactly, yeah. And so, and they're enjoying themselves. They're like kids, you know, but it's this kind of fake little bubble that's being watched over by O'Brien the whole time. You know, it's allowed because they know Winston's a problem. But you're right in terms of how it connects to our own world, especially. I mean, when we think about any kind of explanatory system, like when you talk about love is impossible to explain. It just happens, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why I think in every society for a very long time, love is very dangerous historically. And that's why you have systems in place to control women often, because of the danger of love and how that can kind of wreck societies and wreck people. And I think that this is an explanatory system like codependency kind of undermines the power of love, right? It tries to take it away and pull it back. And Orwell's kind of making fun of that, right? We're in a system where they try to use words to take away emotional realities and connections between people. The most powerful of those being love, right? And a word that is resisted explanation for as long as humans have been around, right? Mm-hmm. And yeah, and as we explain them, because there's part of us who want to explain and control things like love because it's scary, right? Because freedom is scary, essentially. And I think you could argue that people who put it in those terms, right, to satisfy their understanding of it, are doing that by shutting down the possibility of it, right? And so what do you give up to? It's one of the age-old questions, like to get security, to get a sense of stability, you give up your freedom. Mm-hmm. It happens in every society and happens individually in different ways. And I think with love is one of those biggest ways, and you're definitely right. 1984 is thinking about that. That's one of the last escape routes. Love is explosive and free, and yet you find out even that has been hemmed in and thought through by O'Brien. Yeah,
I think if you want a sense of that, you just think of a marriage counselor, right? And they see it all, and they have to have some sort of dispassion, I'm sure. And of course, they don't, denounce love, or,
right?
They're all about making the relationship work. But like, what does it all come to? I just think of Marx's famous phrase. To be radical is to get to the root of things, and the root of humans are humans. He would say the root of man is man. And so, like, the question in the book about the relationship between Julia and Winston, which is the heart of the book, even if you would want to argue the O'Brien politics is the heart of it. The heart of it is his holding on to what's special, and that's what breaks him. Is they sort of got to him and say, look, it's just codependency, and then he sort of, this is my way of explaining it. He says yes, like it didn't mean anything to begin with, which to me is like taking like what really counts to people across all time on this planet and just saying no, like it's all a fiction. You're at the root of it. If you want to call it, Valentine's and special feelings and all of that. Well, my point would be you have to make it that way. It's not that way, because of some script, or what would make it that way. Like love true to the planet. Like
right.
It's us. It's humans doing love, right? We're the root of love.
He loves Big Brother. I think that's such a big point, though. I mean, love is crucial here. And I would say, like, you're right, love has been around since day one. And you have stories of, like, teenage love often, right, of people trying to... And you have society after society creating story after story.
Adam and Eve.
Right. But, I mean, in society stories mostly, historically, before the last 300 years or so, they don't champion love as a value, it's something that ends destructively every time in most like traditional stories, right? Because a society exists to, you arrange marriages, right? You work within the system. Love's great, the idea of it, but it's grown into, right? And the state gives it to you, whether it's called a state or whatever society you're in. It's only a kind of relatively recent development and a very bourgeois thing, possibly. This idea where love itself is an end, right? And can satisfy and move people forward.
The choice in love is of the after the 1000 AD, yeah,
right. And
because you have arranged marriages, you still see what do I want to say? Not just fragments, but there's still behaviors of that.
Right.
Arranged marriage.
I think even it's probably up to the late 1800s in terms of divorce laws and things like that. It wasn't an option. Like, it doesn't matter if you're not in love. You stay, you're married. That's how it goes. Like, it was a social status thing, a marriage. It wasn't a love thing. They had love stories, but it's like Romeo and Juliet love stories. It doesn't end well. And they love the idea of it and they love talking about it. But at the end of the day, marriages were arranged and society was arranged in certain ways. I think, to me, when I read 1984, Winston is like very much in that kind of idea. He's still this childish idea of love, right? And he's taught through the course of the book to love Big Brother. You fully love the society you're in. You will feel fulfillment in a real way. That's what O'Brien's point.
Yeah. The thing is, give up Julia. It's Big Brother.
Right. And I think that, when you talk about love and like the capital L love, and we think about love of God versus like love of romantic relationships. And church, politics, and many societies have argued, that's going to run its course. Attraction comes and goes.
They call it lust.
Codependency. Yeah, it goes. It's not love. And that requires society to say, like, a parent being like, choose the right person. That's the right financial situation, blah, blah, blah. And I think that Orwell's doing like a satire of this like new version of it. It's kind of going back to an older way of being, right? Where you love your state, you love the world that you're in, you don't love an individual person. And Winston's holding on. And at one last love, because I love this kind of looking at this as a love book, but no one I don't think has ever discussed it.
It is.
But I would say O'Brien loves Winston, and his obsession, the way he's torturing him at the end, that long thing. I know it's a weird way to look at it. Winston's mind intrigues O'Brien. O'Brien is the one who's orchestrating all this stuff. And his hatred of Winston's mind is also this weird kind of love thing where, how hatred and love are very close sometimes in the spectrum of being. And I feel that when you can read that sexually in terms of this ending scene where you have this long discussion between O'Brien and Winston. And because Winston's intriguing to O'Brien, he's someone that is the problem, right? And he orchestrates all this for Winston, like to kind of break him down. And towards the dialogue, towards the end, when he's arguing with him, it gets very much like, for even O'Brien, Winston's the only thing to do. He's the only thing that's special and different. If I can break you, I've achieved true love. And so there's an obsession, I guess, with Winston. And I think that's kind of the hidden power to me, the pulse of the book, is that, when he finally breaks it, he chooses to love Big Brother, but he's choosing O'Brien, and O'Brien needs that. And there's a neediness in Big Brother himself, if O'Brien is Big Brother. But if that makes any sense, it's a weird angle.
I read it differently, and I'm always gratified, to have these discussions. So I don't mean to be, just playing devil's advocate. I really think that O'Brien is mechanical. I think he knows he's going to break Winston, and I don't think there's anything to it except, I'm going to grind you down in the way that I grind everybody else down. I guess to your argument, the other, like Sims and these other characters, they just disappear, for no reason. They want to be good party members. So he doesn't have to break them down, and that might argue your point.
I think O'Brien's the only real character in the book to me, and in terms of he comes in the background, he haunts it, and it is like Winston almost becomes a real human being, but he breaks him too.
I don't think there's any doubt that he's going to break Winston. That's my point. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. The first time I read it, I was like, "Come on, Winston, you got this. Just hold on to it. 2 + 2 does not equal 5. Like, just hold on to that." And it's so incredibly powerful because I just really feel O'Brien has invented another way of existence, another world, and he's trying to prove that you can use fantasy, which is like this one of the main points of the book for me. You can use art even to reframe and re-see and reimagine the world and make it real. And you have Winston saying, no, there's reality. He's like a good old-fashioned British common sense guy. You know that famous story where like Berkeley's philosophy, like we're all living in God's dream, and like that was it. And then what is it, Samuel Johnson responded to it. He read it and he went over and kicked a rock, and he's like, I disproved his whole philosophy, and the refutation of Berkeley. And that's a very English thing to do. This is reality. Obviously, enough talk. Reality is the stuff you touch. And Winston is like the last living Englishman, and he's like saying, this empirical stuff I touch is truth, right? And O'Brien's like, no, we live in fantasy land now. I can make the world. I can make you love it and think it is the world. And to me, it's this contest between the two. And he finds out slowly but surely that nothing that he touched was what he thought it was, and that the empirical world that was valued for 300 years since the scientific enlightenment, a revolution, is no more. We're in a brave new world, the other big dystopian book of that time. But that's to me was like the why I put O'Brien as like a war between the two of them, and two kind of like ways of being. And Julia just always felt like a pawn to me within that, and the other characters within it. But yeah, I mean, how do you become a real person in a world like this is a bigger question too.
The other characters other big love story that we should mention is O'Brien and the Proles. He has a great hope in the
Winston in the Proles.
I said O'Brien, Winston.
O'Brien.
I knew I got that wrong.
O'Brien, what is he going to do with the Proles? And that's it's the other angle of the love story. Yeah, because he says he loves the Proles, right? They're going to save us somehow. And it's one of the famous endings to the book to me, like are the Proles really going to be, some people argue the book has some hope in it, and they'll be like, look at the Proles, like they're going to rise up one day. They're not going to stand for this. The middle managers like Winston, they're going to love the system. But one day the Proles, but then the end of the book, you have the Proles like cheering another war somewhere, and they're watching on TV, people get blown up, and Winston's drunk watching Big Brother. And so that ending is very hard to read in that light, but I've always held to that line because he still says there's hope in the Proles.
I guess the reason why I bring it up is because I want to reference, we only have 7 minutes. I want to reference the working class. Like the Proles are the people with dirt under their nails, right? And the book doesn't really hold out any hope, and I thought that was interesting. It's like, no, the real humanity, that's some sort of natural goodness, nature in quotation marks, is in the Proles, and somehow they're going to step forward is both historically, an important point and an important point in the book, right? They just, there's nothing to the Proles. I say Proles, that's what.
Okay, yeah, it could be that. Yeah, definitely. The Proles, I think, and it is definitely, that's where the politics come in. He's speaking directly to the arguments of the period that the Proles did not rise up, the working class did not rise up in the way they thought. And it's always the intellectual class that gets tied into these things.
And you can see why he would be critical of the masses.
Right.
Because of fascism, in short. Yeah.
Right. And you have that coming up in how they reacted, and then there's a sense of enormous failure there. But every time I read the book, I still feel that he has hope still. He's like, the author does. Winston's kind of lost in this world, right? He's done. But I feel the author still, even though after time and time and again, he's seen the Proles not do the thing they should, he still has hope that they will.
Classic John Lennon, you're a working class hero, but you're still a blah, blah, blah peasant to me.
Right.
It's kind of a challenge. Like, if any pro is reading this, like, this is a challenge to you, because it almost speaks to an elitism.
Right, and that speaks to his background. I was reading some essays, and I'm almost out of time, but talking about his experiences in the Spanish Civil War, where he was serving with a lot of like what would be working class guys, and how he writes about them has this kind of, he wants them he knows that only they can like save the world, essentially, but he also is very much aware of his own background and his class background, and there's a tension there, which is the tension for all this kind of these conversations when we have these kind of like intellectual understandings of how to save the world, and a system that says that the working class is the one that should be doing. They have a freedom that the intellectuals don't because they're raised within the system, and they're beneficiaries of the system. And so they're too much tied to actually be free from it in any real way. And everything they do actually ties them back in. And then, so it's romanticizing the working class. And and I think in the next 30 years, you have even like Lenin, people like that, or John Lennon, able to see the problem with that kind of way of looking, that romanticization of the working class and what that means. And time again, you see that kind of play out in revolutionary politics.
Very brief history lesson. So 1848, not 84, but 1848, you had the February Revolution, which is the moment that Marx thought that the working class and the socialists, remember we're talking about Stalin down the road here 100 years later, but the point for Marxism was to show the potential in both socialism, separate from the working class struggle. You know, those are two different things. And then here we have 100 years later, Orwell talking about the proles, and it just does not look like the working class, or is going to follow socialism.
It is not, and you're right. I think the light of this book coming out when it did, right after World War II, and the rise of fascism and what it meant and what he saw for the world, it's a very kind of despairing book in that light. I think it's interesting, though, in terms of our other conversation, and we're almost out of time, thinking about the art, whether it has efficacy, whether it can change the world or make us think differently or still have power, right? That was kind of our original question. And I think, again, like 1984 in and of itself proves Orwell somewhat wrong. I mean, this book is still vital for a lot of people. And I think you go to like the political discourse, which is kind of comic. I mean, very Orwellian, as they say, is that like both the left and the right see Orwell as their hero. Like the current right, like the Trumpist right, they see him as like he's speaking for us. And the left also sees it as like he's speaking for us. And Orwell might laugh at that because the way it can be, his own same words can be used by both sides to say completely different things. And he was very aware of that irony. But I feel at the end of the day, there is like a moral force, like a drumbeat in it, that is human. He's still seeking out and searching out the human. And there's a hope despite all this kind of horror show around it and how words are abused and manipulated. And I think, that's worth celebrating. I also think it just shows that people still read and take art seriously, whatever politics they have, I guess.
And I will take the counterpoint that this is a satire and as dark as it can get, and it's a challenge to not be ground down to the inhuman. Yeah.
Well, I'm not. Yeah, I guess in terms of his own, I'm saying why the book is kind of gone, right, and what it has become. And I guess thinking about the last couple weeks, we've been looking at whether art ended in 1945 or not. And I think this book proves it didn't.
It didn't. Okay. With that, we'll have to leave it there, and we're going to cue up the closing music. And thanks for listening. We're coming to you live from Caroline Street. We have Fun Drive in 2 weeks, so be sure you go to kpft.org and show your appreciation of this fine radio station. And good night. And anything else?
No. Good talking, and looking forward to seeing you all next week.
All right. And thanks to Messiah Tamagai.
It's 90.1 KPFT. Time to check in with the R&R show.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Wikipedia.
As anybody who knows me knows that I'm a little nuts. I've got a lot of...
It's amazing some of the things that are in Ronnie's head. It's also amazing some of the things that are not in Ronnie's head.
Who have you talked to
Propriety,
today?
responsibility, things like that.
Who have you talked to
Everybody
already today?
Everybody.
Okay, the lady around the corner at the
Yeah.
Chevron.
Ooh.
Yeah.